Just as there are those who may steal energies from the most powerful of entities, so there are those who may feed upon the faculties of those shamans themselves. As a person alone, unaffected by demonic influence, these individuals are harmless, and to some extent beneficial to the general human and gifted populations. Generally affected from birth by a weakened physical state, they may by chance find that by the taking of minute amounts of subsidiary energy from the gifted, they can sustain their existences indefinitely. However, upon contact with malignant entities, the individual can be transformed into a horribly destructive force against those gifted it may come in contact with. The individual can be used to amass a vast reservoir of energy by demonic entities, in essence, becoming a harvester for their horrid purposes. The fate of one of these sad creatures would be pitiable if it were not for the swath of death and horror most often associated with their existence. Chapter 10. The Lamian, the Book of the Skull. They sat huddled around Angel's desk, with Jessie seated at the keyboard as Angel herself paced behind, her face drawn and exhausted from the events of the past week. Jesse ran his hand warily over his shaved scalp as he returned to his work, clicking through various websites, scanning articles and pictures with uncanny speed. Ryan stood at his side, leaned over the desk with his gun holster hanging over his shoulders as he spoke to Angel. Diedrich, having already been briefed on the latest information, stood pensively by the window, his deep-set gray eyes lost behind the clouds of smoke rolling up from his mouth. "I just don't like the idea of sending Cho after that thing alone," Angel said, as she turned her back to them to conceal the worry she felt for Cho's safety. Cho, standing beside Diedrich, said nothing, and pretended he did not notice the concern in Angel's voice. "We don't have any choice, Angel. He's the only one who would even stand a chance," Jesse explained, as he brought up a newspaper headline from a few months previous. "We think this is our guy," he said, gesturing at the picture now filling the screen. "This kid disappeared earlier this year, and he fits the criteria you gave us. The question is this the kid you met back in Colorado?" "I don't know," she said, turning and forcing herself to study the picture. "That is the Shadow Walker. But whether I met him 6 years ago..." "Wait a minute." She came close and, putting her hands on Jesse's shoulders, stared intently at the screen. "Scroll down," she said, pointing at a smaller picture in the corner of the online newspaper. It was a picture of the missing boy's parents and grandparents being interviewed in front of their home in Washington. "That old couple. That's them. I'm sure of it. They were the ones who brought the boy to the clinic." "That is a positive ID," Diedrich said decisively as he relit his enormous pipe with the bowl carved in the likeness of a dragon. "Now, we must act quickly." "But we know that someone has been helping this kid. We need to know who," Cho said, stepping out from the cherry-smelling smoke now clouding the old German psychic. "I agree," Diedrich replied thoughtfully, "but we can only hope you will find more clues when you locate the boy. Right now, our utmost concern is the safety of Angel and the rest of our organization. Now that we know who he is, we have at least a dozen remote viewers who are on hand, waiting to track down his whereabouts. Ryan and Jesse will take Angel to a safe house, while you will be sent after this Harris Levine. I will go to Washington and see if I can find out anything from the boy's family. It is regretful that you must undertake this task alone, Cho. However, I fear that with this boy's ability to appear and disappear at will, we would be rendered at his mercy. You are the only one amongst us who may have any chance of catching him off guard. Ryan and Jesse, you must reveal to no one where you are taking Angel." Ryan slapped Jesse on the shoulder and smiled. "You can count on us, Dieter." Diedrich shook his head at the use of his unfortunate nickname. "Then it is agreed. We will begin tonight, and Cho will set off as soon as we have a location." Cho looked at Angel's eyes and winked roguishly. "Don't worry about me, boss lady. This is what I do best." "This isn't a mob hit, Cho," she snapped, her voice low and frightened. "None of you have seen this thing. He's not just a boy. The skull called this thing a Lamian, and they eat psychics. We are nothing but a tall glass of water to it, and I don't like the idea of delivering Cho like a pizza to its front door. Angel, I have seen something like this before long ago, and I do not underestimate its power," Diedrich said, putting a fatherly hand on Angel's own. "You are taking the information from this book at face value." "If I could only believe that." "I shouldn't," she answered, letting her long hair, now almost completely white, fall down over her face as she wept, unable to hide her fear anymore. The doorbell rang. Mary Levine, not expecting anyone, peeked cautiously through the peephole of the front door to see a handsome, tall, older man with a mostly bald, gray-haired head standing calmly on her front porch, smiling at her. "Who is it?" she said through the small 6-inch window that she had to stand on her tiptoes to see through. Miss Levine, my name is Lieutenant Heinz Jorgensen, and I am a consultant for the Washington State Police Department. I have been sent to perform a follow-up investigation on the disappearance of your son." She stared at him suspiciously for a moment and was just about to ask him to show his badge when she was suddenly overcome with a wave of pure relaxation, gazing into the man's tranquil gray eyes. She immediately became aware of the man's great resemblance to her father, despite his obviously German accent and no further reservation, unlocking the door and inviting him in. "Why, thank you, Miss Levine." He walked past her and turned to shake her hand gently. His touch was warm and soothing as she noticed a smoky cherry scent which surrounded him. She was put into the mindset of a cozy tavern or beer hall filled with laughing people and distant, cheerful music. The dark cloud of loss and sadness which had hung suspended over her every thought for the past few months was lifted and forgotten as she showed him to the living room and offered him a seat in Sean's favorite chair. "Would you like something to drink?" she said, finding herself playing the hostess as if he were a close friend or neighbor. Do you have coffee?" he said with a smile as he removed a large pipe from within his coat with an expensive-looking leather pouch in his pocket. "Yes," she answered, feeling that she must try hard to please the man. "My husband keeps a very old Scotch for special occasions. Would you like some?" "No, but I thank you. I do not drink, Frau Levine." She walked to the kitchen, withdrew a cup, which she filled with fresh black coffee, and somehow knew her guest would want cream and 2 spoonfuls of sugar. Taking it to him, she found him packing tobacco into the enormous black dragon-headed pipe. "Do you mind if I smoke?" he asked, and she excitedly answered that it would be wonderful, as she couldn't wait to smell the delicious aroma it would exude. "Goodness, Frau Levine, just as I like my coffee. However, did you know? Did you read my mind?" She giggled, delighted to have pleased her guest, and sat across from him as he took a sip, and placing the glass carefully on a coaster, struck a match to light his pipe. "You know, my great-grandmother was supposed to be a psychic." This drew an interested look from the lieutenant. "Really? And where was she from?" "Oh, they were from the Ukraine, but My mother always told me that she knew what people were going to say before they spoke, and she could also find things with a dowsing rod. Huh. Perhaps this gift has been passed on in your family, he said as smoke drifted around him in a wonderful blue hypnotic cloud. Has anyone else in your family ever displayed any unusual activities? Just Harris. I'd nearly forgotten. It's been so long. But now that I think about it, when he was little, he was always saying things that were out of place. Out of place? How? Well, he was just learning to talk, and he would comment about things that we'd said when he was asleep, or even weren't in the house. Like, he'd ask me about the rude man at the store who pushed me even though he wasn't there when it happened, as if he'd saw it. Or one time, Sean threw his car keys into the trash compactor and spent all day looking for them. And little Harris found them. He walked right over and took them out as if he had known all along. But we assumed that he probably threw them in there himself. You thought differently, though, didn't you? Yes, I did. Because I knew how Sean was about those keys, and there's no way Harris could have gotten hold of them. We were always so scared of him getting hold of something dangerous. We just considered ourselves so fortunate to have him. Alive, the lieutenant finished, his voice low and full of empathy as Mary gazed down at the floor, a tear sliding from her soft blue eyes. I want to help in any way I can, Frau. But may I ask to see the young man's room? Yes, of course you can, she replied cheerfully. She wiped away the tear and showed the lanky older man to the stairs. She opened the door to Harris's room, but before he entered, he turned to her and, putting a long, bony hand on her shoulder, said warmly, "You were very busy when I arrived. Do not let me keep you from your business. Please go. Continue your day while I work here." She smiled as she resisted the urge to rub her cheek on his warm, wrinkled hand like a love-struck kitten. Then turning, she went downstairs to continue her work selling real estate online. She had been in the middle of an important land deal with a buyer from Wisconsin when the doorbell rang. She could not fathom how she had forgotten such a high priority so easily. Diedrich closed the door behind him and gazed about the small bedroom with the practiced eyes of a professional officer. In his long career, he had worked homicide and missing persons for years before eventually being promoted to the position from whence he had retired. However, here and now, he was virtually overwhelmed with the horrible energy which saturated every fiber of the room and entire house. "Oh, my dear boy, what did you get yourself into?" he said as he kicked the throw rug to the floor aside to reveal the chalk-drawn circle beneath. Diedrich closed his eyes and listened intently to the churning, instinctual senses now pulling him to the bed. He approached and felt a pulse of morose energy emanating from the bookshelf on the headboard. Reaching forward, his hand was drawn as if by a magnet to a book which lay tucked between J.K. Rowling novels. "Here, Harris, you are not nearly as fortunate as our Harry Potter, were you?" he whispered, as he withdrew an ancient black notebook. Opening it, his stomach lurched as he viewed the contents. "Oh, dear boy, you were not so much seeking darkness as you were poisoned by it." He closed it and stood wondering how a 15-year-old boy had come into possession of such a rare object. Moving to the computer, he sat down and took the small device Jesse had given him from his pocket. Untangling the cord, he plugged it into the USB port and powered on the hard drive. He waited and watched as the device immediately decoded Harris's password and, logging on, began sending the entire contents of Harris's files to Jesse at Angel's computer. Cho prowled the room known formerly as the Guild Hall, originally designed as a huge library. The addition of a massive circular table capable of seating at least 20 had designated it as the main meeting chamber for Angel's organization. At the table were seated 18 of the most skilled remote viewers from around the world, encircling an enormous map of the country, over which was suspended a light silver tripod, from whence a silken string supporting a large, glittering crystal swung like a pendulum. The group with hands clasped sat with eyes closed in silence as they focused their energies on finding the boy shown in the copied pictures laid before each. The crystal was continuously being drawn now to a spot over the northeast United States, where after 3 passes, it suddenly locked, the string drawn taut. Ryan approached and eyed the area indicated. After returning to a far table and rummaging through a pile, withdrew another map, this one of the state of Washington. The process began again as he laid it beneath the tripod and watched expectantly as the pendulum once more began swinging. After a few moments, the crystal once more began hovering over an area in the western part of the state. Looking up at Cho, he whispered, "He's still in 10 trees." At the same moment, Ryan's cell phone vibrated in his pocket. Retreating to the quiet corner of the room by the drawn curtains of the window, he answered. Jesse's voice spoke as he listened. "Ryan, you and Cho have to come to Angel's room. There's something you need to see." Ryan hung up without responding and gestured to Cho. They both quietly left the room. "There's something strange going on here, guys," Jesse said as they entered and walked anxiously around to the pool to where he and Angel sat in front of the monitor. "I've got this kid's entire hard drive here, and there's some seriously messed up things going on before he disappeared. Someone emailed him about 13 PDF files full of the names and addresses of just about everyone in Angel's Circle. But that's not the worst part. There are diagrams and floor plans for these houses and neighborhoods here. This kid has detailed maps complete with notes on their habits and living arrangements too. Someone had been tracking and studying us for a very long time." "Insider information," Cho said coldly. "More than that," Angel replied, her fist clenched with rage. As she looked up, fighting contained the urge to scream with bewildered anger. "This is a combination of leaked private information, spying, and psychic intuition. Diedrich found a grimoire in the boy's room that had been doctored with notes and hints. Diedrich thinks that the boy was tricked into summoning demonic entities without a containment circle." Joe stared at the other three with confusion. "But I thought you said Dieter found a circle in his room." "He did," Jesse said, still scrolling across the countless files on the screen. "But it was a summoning circle. There's supposed to be another circle as well in which the entity is contained. And I do mean entity, since trying to draw in more than one of these things at once is suicide. So these things just showed up and ran loose," Angel finished ominously. "When he checked online news for the days previous to Harris's disappearance, we found all kinds of bizarre stories about early pest infestations and mold outbreaks. Someone gave a passive psychic an altered spellbook and let him off the chain." Jesse's tone was unbelieving and dumbfounded. "Then sent him hunting after the guild." Joe could not comprehend the level of evil it would take for this to occur. Growing up in organized crime, he was all too familiar with men who could manipulate and destroy others' lives for profit, but he could not imagine people who could so succinctly use and plot the corruption of others' very souls. "Well, then our news may not be all that welcome," Ryan said, as he loosened his tie and looked into Angel's eyes, with fear darkening his own. "Harris Levine is still in 10 Trees, Washington. We better get Dieter the hell out of there." "He should already be on his way back," Jesse said, closing the screen. "I just talked to him, and he was finishing up at the boys' house." "Good. He doesn't know Harris is there, so he won't think to do anything stupid." Angel attempted to ignore the gnawing worry that was building in her chest. "But then again," Ryan said, saying what they were all thinking, He is psychic. Diedrich walked from the porch of the large house and back towards the street where his rental car waited on the curb. It was a beautiful spring day, and he stood for a moment at the end of the walk so as to take in the peaceful neighborhood. He listened to the birds chirping and tweeting amongst the branches of the green trees. Closing his eyes, he listened as the warm noonday breeze blew amongst them. The darkness behind his closed eyelids all at once began to swirl with a mix of intruding images. He was seeing the same street, but through a lens tinted with a gray haze. He saw the street as it had looked months ago, complete with tree limbs laid bare by winter in a cold, steel-colored sky. Even as he stood, unmoving, the image began traveling, and opening his eyes, he began to follow in the path of the originator of the vision, who he knew to be Harris Levine. In this faded leftover memory, which was hanging like a cloud in the energy fields around the house, Harris was walking down the street towards some distant destination. Looking down at the key in his hand, Diedrich shook his head and decided to follow. He was seeing the street as it had looked to Harris, and Diedrich quickly ascertained that much of the darkness which tainted the vision came from Harris's emotional state and not the actual lighting of the day. In Diedrich's experience, such projected memories rarely were acute video recordings of past events, but more often were like perceptual impressionistic art. Memories often appeared abstract and altered by the emotional, psychological state of the viewer. Harris's perceptual imagery, at least at the time of this memory, was very morbid and dark, its outlines blurred with the morose contemplation of early mortality. Diedrich had not walked for long before he arrived at a wooded park that lay 6 blocks down at the end of the street. Diedrich found himself walking past the playground and picnic areas towards a path that led off the paved walkway that circled the areas of woods. To his eyes, the woods were bright and vibrant with blooming flowers and depths of green, swaying patterns of lush undergrowth and branches above. The sun showed unrelentingly warm and alive in the blue, cloudless sky. However, in his mind, the brightness and colors melted into shadowy, decaying melancholia. Darkness was draped in strangling tendrils over Harris's entire world. Diedrich began following the path down into the woods. Diedrich was noticing odd details about the park. Concrete structures jutted from the bushes, and walkway was of an unusual course. After a few brief moments of intuitive contemplation, he came to the conclusion that originally, perhaps as far back as the 30s, the town of 10 Trees had actually been here. At some point in the community's youth, this section had been abandoned, and the inhabitants had relocated to the current area of the prospering populous city. Diedrich reached for that cause, but could find only the sensation that it had been something horrible, impossibly violent. As he wandered further on, his mind began to meander as well to a certain subject which he felt might be some indication as to the nature of the mystery. In Germany at the end of World War I, a man named Fritz Hartmann was arrested for the murder of some 27 people over a period of 6 years. What made Fritz all the more memorable was that he had been selling the flesh of his victims on the black market unbeknownst to his customers. And so, after his capture, he was dubbed the Butcher of Hanover. At the time, no one knew exactly what to call a person such as Fritz other than a monster. But in historical retrospect, he was a prototypical serial killer, complete with sexually disturbed childhood and all. It was as Diedrich reflected on the case that he first glimpsed a small portion of gray brick wall in the foliage of thick bushes 20 yards off the path to his left. As he began carefully walking through the thorns and branches of the forest, he realized the wall was indeed a part of a complete structure that had been consumed by the plants and eroding earth of the woods. He He stepped into a clear space of ground that seemed to run alongside the wall, and following it, found himself looking intently at a doorway that had at one time been completely boarded up with plywood, but which had long since rotted away, leaving only an open, cavernous rectangle. In the stone, from within there came the smell of dank, moist earth and decay. Diedrich placed one hand upon the brakes, and even though he was not a touch-no, Diedrich was immediately aware of why Fritz Hartmann had so readily leapt into his mind. This had long ago been a large brick butcher shop, which had sat just off the main square of the small town which had once been Tin Trees in the 1930s. Reaching to his coat, Diedrich withdrew a small black pocket flashlight, and flicking on the blue-white LED beam, he peered into the darkness within. He saw a variety of insects flying through the light, which was so far beyond any normal accumulation that Diedrich had ever witnessed that there was little doubt that the Shadow Walker was here. Moss, mold, and fungus grew on every surface within the building, and then to Diedrich's horror, he heard a sound issuing from within the blackness beyond what had originally been the front business corner of the shop, the muffled whine of a human being. Quickly, Diedrich pulled his phone from his holder on his belt and without looking, dialed Angelica's private cell. Before she could even speak, he whispered, "I have found him, Angelica, and I believe that he has someone captive." The other side of the conversation was a worried babble of warnings, reprimands, and tears, which Diedrich silenced. "Quiet! Stop your foolish nonsense and listen, Angelica. I cannot risk leaving someone to die or to be tortured. If anything happens, know that I love you, and say goodbye to the boys for me. It is time for you to leave. He may come for you. By the way, in case it proves helpful, I am at the ruins of a butcher shop, somewhere off of a hiking trail in the town park. Auf Wiedersehen, mein Kind." Diedrich hung up as he carefully began to crawl through the doorway. Upon crossing the threshold, he was immediately aware of a strong energy field, which was encapsulating the structure. Once inside, he felt as if he had entered another's nightmare. The dimensions of the building's interior did not match the outer structure, and in the darkness beyond the first room, Diedrich beheld a warping of the physical architecture which pushed the boundaries of perception into the realm of madness. The walls moved in slow, heaving undulations, as if he was in the throat of some horrendous creature, and across these mold-covered surfaces were hordes of crawling worms and marching insects. At his feet were weaving armies of millipedes and centipedes which blanketed the floor by the thousands. Ahead, he saw a huge metal door that he recognized as the entrance to a central meat locker. As the beam of his flashlight fell upon it, he became aware that the door was ajar, and there was an eerie glow of alternating hues which traced the edges of the rectangular frame. From behind the door, he could still hear muffled sobs and weeping, and as he reached for the handle, he froze at the sound of adolescent giggles echoing as if against the walls of a large chamber. Bracing himself for whatever horrors he may encounter, Diedrich pulled open the door and fell to his knees in disbelief at what lay within. The locker had been transformed into a horrendous dungeon of stone and steel, hanging suspended from the darkness of an impossibly high ceiling were long chains from which dangled the twisted bodies of some 5 corpses, upon which crawled endless multitudes of insect and arthropod. The cold, bloodless bodies thrashed and writhed within bounds of iron chain, animated by unearthly power, slowly succumbing to a grotesque transformation from human into mutated monstrosity. They lived. This energy, which could affect human life and flesh in such a way, was awakening memories from far within his past. He stared as human hands became the clawing legs of spiders, and mouths opened and screamed, stretching into the round, open orifices of leeches. Some eyes stared out in a purely human horror, as others became the black many facets of a fly. Watching over all this was a boy, standing hooded and laughing in the center of the enormous cavern. Diedrich reeled back into the spongy lichen-covered wall, only to leap forward when he was besieged by the insect swarms. Stumbling to his feet, he hysterically swiped and fought to remove the tiny invading legions of crawling pests. He stood gasping as the boy waved a hand casually, and the bugs scrambled away, leaving him trembling and breathless. "I'm sorry for the behavior of my pets," the boy apologized, a bluish light showing from whatever eyes lay beneath the cowl of his hood. "We are not accustomed to uninvited guests. I don't mind, though. Have you come to see my work?" Diedrich only watched speechlessly as the bizarre transformations continued above them on the chains. "I can play with them until they die, and then I can change them. I have to bring them here, though, to do it. But I think that will change soon. My world is growing." The meaning of the Shadow Walker's words became clear, and Diedrich realized that what was at stake here was more than he had even feared. Once more his mind flashed with images of another time, and another young man eerily similar to this one. "Harris, please listen to me," he said, concentrating all his ability on reaching whatever humanity might be left in the being before him. "You have been deceived and used. The book that was given to you was a trap, but it was not too late for you to escape." The Shadow Walker was laughing again with the same insane giggling Diedrich had heard from outside the door. "He knows you, old man. He remembers you young. Do you remember him as well? And you say I've been used, have I? I can do anything I want. I am becoming a god, and the world is my playground. I was weak and dying for 15 years, and now I feel like I could live forever. Would you take that away from me? What do you want? For me to lie down and rot away as the world can be normal? You're one of them, aren't you? One of Angel's gifted psychics running around trying to help people who don't even believe in you. You are all freaks of nature with your gifts and power. And here I am, stranger and more powerful than all of you, and you want me dead. Well, guess what, old man? I'm not going anywhere." As the Shadow Walker spoke, Diedrich carefully removed the snub-nosed .38 revolver from his coat and opened fire. As the first 4 shots pierced the boy's chest, Diedrich saw Harris's eyes for the first time, and waves of sorrow washed over him at the stunned terror on the boy's round white face. The last 2 shots he placed expertly in each of the pale blue eyes, and he watched with resignation as the small, thin adolescent fell to the floor of the cavern. The space around him began to shrink as the plague of creatures rushed to their master, cocooning the body in a living mass. Diedrich saw that the floor where the Shadow Walker had fallen was sinking as the nightmare projection of the sphere began imploding. Turning, Diedrich ran back through the doors. The ground throbbed, rumbling beneath his shoes. Ahead, he saw the light of day shining through the distant door as he clawed and pulled his way out onto the earthen floor of the woods. Stumbling 10 paces before falling on legs too old for such exertion, he looked back in time to see the entire hillside above the abandoned building collapse, burying the door and all remnants in tons of fresh black soil. He sat up staring in silence as the birds sang and the breeze shifted aimlessly amongst the green trees. Reaching to his coat, he withdrew his pipe and, tapping it upon the bottom of his shoe, began filling it from the tobacco pouch given to him by his late wife. A moment later, he smoked calmly and reflected on what he had seen and what the boy had said. "I can play with them until they die, and then I can change them." Diedrich suddenly felt very old and very frightened in the vast vast woods alone. The words, even the voice, had rang so familiar that it was as if he stood in the shadows of his memories. "It's over," Angel whispered as she placed the phone on her desk. Esther and Teddy stood waiting behind her to see her off as Ryan, Jesse, and Joe had begun carrying her bags to the car. "What do you mean?" Esther asked as she worriedly wrung her hands, having spent the past 2 hours in tears. "Diedrich found him and killed him. He's on his way back." Angel's voice was distant and soft, as if speaking from a trance. "And is Diedrich okay?" Teddy, having played chess every Sunday afternoon with the old German for the past 2 years, had come to think of Dieter as his closest friend. "He's fine," Angel answered, as if she could not believe her own words. "He found him in some kind of abandoned building, but he said he would have to explain the rest later." Outside the room, Ryan and Jesse were going through the doors when Cho suddenly grabbed them both by their suit coats. "He got him!" Cho yelled with astonishment. What are you talking about?" Ryan said, studying the unusual merriment in Cho's eyes. "The old-timer shot the Shadow Walker. Angel's gonna tell us when we go in." "Damn," Jesse said, shaking his head with astonishment. "Them old German dudes don't play around." Ryan laughed with more than a little admiration for the 71-year-old man. "How do you think it went down?" Jesse asked, forgetting the fact that Angel was the one who had actually spoken to the elderly detective. "Maybe the Shadow Walker underestimated Mr. Abenjoth based on his age," Cho suggested. "Don't forget that he can charm water from a stone if he tries hard enough." Ryan remembered the first time he had met the old detective and could still recall how easy it was to glibly give away his darkest secrets after only a few minutes of conversation. They hastily entered and found Angel sitting at her desk in a daze as Esther hugged her gleefully through joyous tears and Teddy kneeled before her, patting her knee comfortably. "You already know, don't you?" she stated, her eyes locking on Cho. "Sorry, I already gave away the good news." Cho apologized sheepishly. "It's okay," she said with a dark, troubled expression hidden behind a delicate smile. "Aren't you happy? Dieter wasted the Shadow Walker," Ryan said, trying to understand the sadness he sensed in Angel. "I know, and I hate to rain on my own parade, but whoever was helping Harris is still out there." "And," Cho questioned as he already began to hear a future echo of her next words, "I had wondered how seriously to take the Book of the Skull. If any of it was exaggeration or fantasy, but based on just a few things Diedrich just said, it's all true. The book is discussing realities, and that means all of its warnings are true. There are actually hidden entities out there generating horrible energies and using psychics to alter the fabric of reality. We are operating on a totally different playing field here, guys. Whoever is watching the guild knows as much as we do about the things in the book, and they are more than willing to use them against us." "Angel, this is ridiculous," Ryan said, scratching his beard with obvious frustration. "He hasn't even spoken to you in months. Now he wants to throw you a party?" "Angelica, I concur with Ryan on this account. It is irrational for us to make this trip simply because you feel guilty about leaving the show." Diedrich sat on the couch, but Angel could feel him reaching out to her in a veiled attempt to influence her decision. First of all, stop trying to control my thoughts, Dieter, she said with an edge of warning in her voice. Secondly, I have been hiding like a refugee for months now, and I want to see people. Third, I do feel guilty. Peter Agrand put me on the air and helped us build this organization, and I repaid him by dropping out and trashing every sponsor I ever had. The least I can do is go to this damn party and try to reconcile with him. It will be okay. No one is going to try and hurt me in the middle of an event like this. Besides, he owns the hottest club in Portland, and you guys might actually have fun. Cho, what do you think? I love parties, Cho answered offhandedly as he smiled at Angel. Over the past 5 months, his cold exterior had melted as he gradually grew to become a true member of the guild. He had found himself more accepted and with more friends than he ever would have dreamed possible in his lifetime. Unfortunately, he was also well aware that Angel had slowly been letting her defenses drop with the death of the Shadow Walker. However, his closeness to her had increased to the point where he could deny her little, if anything. It's settled then. We're going to Portland, and we're going to have fun. Possibly the biggest and most exclusive nightclub of the Northwest. Club Estrange was a hotspot for anyone with enough money or reputation to make it through the doors. Frequented by celebrities from the art world all the way to actors of the stage and screen, it was an eclectic mess of personalities and egos. The crowd that hovered outside the front entrance surpassed Cho's expectations, and immediately he became aware of a panoramic nightmare of possibilities and events occurring by the hundreds around him. He was besieged by the very concept that in a crowd, virtually anything was possible. He scanned every face and noted with increasing unease the now all too familiar presence of the darkly clad young people with the pale, drugged countenances who had grown so accustomed to seeing outside of Angel's walls. Before stepping out of the limousine, he found himself taking Angel's hand in his own and whispering, "Maybe Dieter and Ryan are right. Let's just go to a restaurant or something. Your buddy Peter can meet us there." Angel smiled reassuringly and gently squeezing his hand as she kissed his cheek. "Just relax. You'll have a blast." He nodded his consent, and they stepped from the car to greet the crowd. Once inside, he immediately found a glass of champagne thrust into his hand, and as he sipped his way into a third, he found himself easing into the setting with little hesitation. They were seated in a private booth overlooking a spacious dance floor, where faces he recognized only from television and movies talked and mingled to the medium pace of the club dance remixes, playing from what seemed like every wall and corner. The lighting was a warm, alternating mixture of reds and firelight orange, cascading from hidden sources over a multitude of sculptures and galleries of modern art. He studied the numerous flat-screen video monitors which displayed the art films and music videos of various New Age groups and artists. Jesse, who sat beside him, nudged his arm and directed his attention to the dozens of computers, complete with private booths which dotted the interior walls and rooms of the club. "What's that all about?" Cho asked as a waitress dressed in gothic attire placed another glass before him. "Samhain, my friend," Jesse answered with a raised eyebrow. "It's all the rage." "Oh, isn't it illegal?" Cho said with a quizzical expression as he witnessed several individuals seating themselves in the booths and pulling down curtains behind them. "Yeah, but so are drugs, and there's no shortage of those here either. I got a friend in Liverpool, and he said they've got clubs full of nothing but computers all over the UK. And that's for nothing but getting high and playing the game. God, such a waste of time. Have you ever played?" I checked it out once, but it's definitely not my style. I like Star Wars Online. Samhain is like Glories of War for serial killers. It's all horror references and the bloody underbelly of history. Not something you want your kids playing. Lots of bad things in the press about it. I've heard. Joe was distracted from the conversation by a tall, darkly tanned man in an Italian suit that had seated himself at the table beside Angel. Cho could tell by the stern, repressed disgust on Diedrich and Ryan's faces that this must be Peter Agrand. Angelica, I am so glad you came, he said with the synthetic intonation of a media slave. This place is amazing, Peter. Would you expect less from me? He said, laughing with what was intended to be false arrogance, but still reeked with traces of true self-exaltation. Cho had already noticed and decided that he was in full agreement with his fellow's assessment of the man as an alpha sleazebag. Cho watched as the man ran a multi-gold-ringed hand through his hair that was black and receding, but being held resentfully in formation by some chemical treatment. Cho could almost hear his grandfather telling him when he had first begun losing his own hair at the age of 19 that a man should accept the appearance that nature dictates or risk appearing the fool before his enemies. A man must look as his fate intends, or forsake the gifts that fate bestows. Cho downed his champagne in 2 gulps and began to already wish the evening was over. The conversation that followed between Angel and Peter was filled with heartfelt, sincere admonishment on Angel's part and gratuitous egotisms on Peter's. Angel tried to eagerly explain her recent blog statements concerning the American corporate elite, while Peter smiled coldly and responded with obvious fraud that he understood completely. Cho had to remind himself that Angel had explained that it had been this man's willingness to give her a chance in her struggling early years that had eventually led to her success. Cho realized that this was a hallmark of Angel's true inner personality, that she constantly overlooked the shortcomings of those around her in order to better the world in which she existed. It had been this very quality that had given him a doorway into her life, and now her heart. Angel was as savvy and conscious of the darker human condition as anyone he had ever met, but she relentlessly chose not to let this be a defining lens through which she saw the world. After a half-hour of conversation, Peter excused himself and departed the table, and it began to seem as if maybe the evening would be more to Cho's liking. The champagne kept flowing, and soon the 5 were laughing and joking as the mood of the club began to take hold on their senses. Cho gazed at the faces of his friends and saw the happy glaze of intoxication begin to shine in their eyes as the music heightened their good humor. Ryan and Jesse were reminiscing over past adventures on the job, recruiting psychics for the guild. Boot Hill, Alabama, Ryan stated, as he lit one of his favorite cigars and blew smoke into Diedrich's already existing cloud of sweet cherry oak-smelling tobacco, his dark brown eyes tearing up with laughter. The cat lady, Jesse added in his recollection. I believe you're speaking of Frau Shaden, who works at the healing center there now, Diedrich questioned, smiling. Although he had refused to drink alcohol, he was contentedly sipping a Virgin Bloody Mary and seemed uncharacteristically lighthearted. All that she cared about was if Angel could heal her diabetic cat, Ryan stated, chuckling. If you could talk to them, then you'd be more concerned about their welfare, Angel said thoughtfully. But what does a cat even say? Jesse asked, holding out his hands in emphasis. I believe she told me once that they are much more caring than one would suspect, Diedrich answered as he concentrated carefully to avoid slurring his speech. Cho laughed, but found it strange that even though the old German wasn't drinking, he still showed all the hallmarks of mild intoxication, and as he finished his first glass, was soon brought another. Cho felt strangely as if he had imbibed more than twice the amount of alcohol that he had drank. He gazed around the room and found to his astonishment that the walls were spinning at the speed of a merry-go-round. Wow! It's been a while since I've drank like this. He placed his hand before him on the table in an attempt to stabilize the movement he was experiencing. I'm going to have to go to the restroom, he said in explanation as he stumbled out of the booth over a clearly amused Angelica. Didn't you tell me once that you can drink a bottle of soju before you're even buzzed? Angel said, laughing as he attempted to straighten his tie and identify a restroom. Ah, I guess I'm out of shape, he said, smiling as he spotted a line of club patrons gathered outside 4 doors. All this clean living has turned me into a lightweight. Ugh, they watched with glee as Cho shuffled off, trying to appear sober. It is odd, but I feel as if I may be tipsy myself, Diedrich commented, eyeing his glass sluggishly as he switched the red liquid in the large tumbler. Ryan and Jesse agreed, but were cut short by the reappearance of Peter Agrand. Angelica, would you be a dear and come with me to meet some admirers of yours? He took her gently by the arm and helped her to her feet as she giggled awkwardly. Sure, Peter. Guys, will you look after Cho for me? We'll take care of him, Ryan said, relighting his cigar. Don't not be gone long, mein kind, or Yun will go hunting for you. Diedrich winked knowingly as she was led off into the crowd. Jesse sat silently as he watched Angel disappear. For the first time that evening, began to feel as if something might be wrong. Maybe we shouldn't let her go alone. His voice was slow and deliberate as he fought to form syllables with much more difficulty than 4 glasses of champagne should result. Oh, she'll be all right, Ryan said, his eyes heavy-lidded, as he swayed slightly from front to back. Yeah, you're probably right, Jesse mumbled sleepily. Cho stood in front of the large mirror, splashing water on his face. His brain was a spinning, distracted whirl of images and half-constructed thoughts as he slapped himself across the cheek in an attempt to achieve even a small degree of sobriety. He hardly noticed that his antics had emptied the rest of the room when he caught the first glimpse of the transparent figure standing behind him in the reflection of the ornate modern deco of the restroom. As his eyes pulled the blurred outline into focus, he realized, turning, that he was face to face with the image of an ancient Korean man. Grandfather. The spirit's eyes were stern and angry as it spoke, but only gradually did Cho begin to tune in to whatever channel on which the ghost was speaking. It took only a moment to realize he was being chastised. You damn love-struck fool! To bring her out into a place such as this! You must go now before it is too late! Cho stared through the haze in his mind as the figure shook its fists violently in his face. You have been drugged, you buffoon! You have delivered her into the hands of her enemies! Go! Cho struggled to comprehend, to reactivate the ability which had been nullified by substance, but found only the swirling perceptions left by the drug's intoxication. He stumbled to the door and out into the crowd, disoriented and lost. He pushed through the shocked onlookers and finally saw the booth where his friends now sat unconscious on the table. Angel was nowhere to be seen, though through it all he could hear his grandfather shouting and enraged as he spotted Peter Legrand standing in the distance, a drink in his hand. The last thing that he remembered seeing before falling to the floor was Peter raising his drink in a mock toast and smiling with bleached white teeth. The 4 woke in a holding cell the next morning. Peter Grant had them arrested for carrying concealed weapons into his club. It had been hours before the drug's effects had worn off, and when it did, they were all taken by a horror and panic like none they had ever known before. They had argued until the guards threatened to layer on further charges, and by the time they were released the following day, there had been no word of Angel's whereabouts. A missing persons report was filed, and a citywide search ensued. She would be found in an alley on the 3rd day, 3 miles from Club Estrange, beaten and stabbed to death by unknown assailants. The official report would state that she had probably been robbed while wandering the streets in a drug-induced haze. Never mind that Angelica Love was a well-known anti-drug advocate. Cho, Jesse, Ryan, and Diedrich would never forgive themselves for what had happened. Together, they swore to bring the culprits to justice. Their justice.